And sorry, Felicitas, that you are going to hear this introduction again for the fourth time. Hello, everyone, and welcome to these public hearings on just transition, on the just transition mechanism. My name is Annabella Rosenberg. I work for the Climate Action Network International, and on behalf of the organizing committee of these public hearings, which is composed of CAN, the Asian People's Movement for Debt and Development, APMDD, the Women and Gender Constituency and Youth Constituency, and the UNFCCC. We would really like to welcome our distinguished experts, also Felicitas as part of the panel, and all of you joining us online to this event towards BAM, the public hearing on the just transition mechanism. For the past few years, civil society has been engaging intensively on just transition at the global climate conferences as a means to ensure that all aspects of climate action embrace the need for securing rights and justice for workers, indigenous peoples, for communities, and support all countries in their efforts to find pathways for their people's dignity and prosperity. COP30 constituted a major landmark for advancing justice, equity, and rights through just transition. A decision was taken there outlining key principles that must be taken into account when advancing just transition. And on top of that, and critical to civil society demands, it committed to develop for decision in 2026 a just transition mechanism that will make all of those principles and aspects become operationalized. Our groups outlined several demands regarding the mechanism, which we have called the BAM, and now stands for the Belém Antalya mechanism for just transition. And as we prepare for the next round of negotiations, we wanted to hear from experts and practitioners well beyond our constituencies, their thoughts on how we can make the just transition mechanism work, learn from past experiences, and also accelerate the good work that is happening on the ground. Instead of having those conversations privately, we have decided to hold them publicly so that they can benefit a much larger audience. In the panel that is just about to start, we are extremely pleased to have with us the oldest Just Transition Commission, the Scottish Just Transition Commission. And we have with us David Reay, Satwat Rehman, and Elliot Ross, along with Katie Swan-Nelson, to share with us their thoughts and their work on just transition. We are going to first hear from them a brief presentation, followed by an interactive conversation with us all. So I would like, without further ado, to introduce you to our colleagues from the Scottish Just Transition Commission. First, we are very pleased to have their co-chairs, Professor David Reay, who's on top of being the co-chair of the commission, he's also chair in carbon management and education at the University of Edinburgh. He's an advisor on climate for a range of governmental and non-governmental organizations across Scotland and the UK. Dave has worked on climate for over 30 years, and a lot of his research has focused on mitigation in land use and agriculture. He also has, multiple, experiences in education and climate education. And before joining the Just Transition Commission, he was executive director of the Edinburgh Climate Change Institute and the policy director of Scotland's Centre of Expertise on Climate Change, Climate for Change. Or climate exchange, I would imagine. We also have Satwat Rehman, the other co-chair of the commission and also the CEO to Parent Family Scotland, a leading charity working with single-parent families in Scotland, providing expert advice, support, and campaigning with parents so that their voices are heard to change systems, policies, and attitudes that today disadvantage single-parent families. More than 50 years experience in voluntary and public sector in Scotland and England, and working on equality, education, employability, economic development, also in early years and childcare. And Satwat has also been a member of multiple commissions and advisory groups, including on the state of women and girls, and also the Wellbeing Economic Alliance. And we have Elliot as well with us, who's the executive director of the Scotland Just Transition Commission, and has been leading their secretariat for the past 4 years. He has led communication and engagement work on the Scottish Climate Assembly, and then formerly a journalist, Elliot is also publishing in multiple very well-known publications, including Guardian, Al Jazeera, Atlantic, Washington Post, I guess the previous one, and The Nation. And we are also super happy to have with us Katie Swan-Nelson, that probably needs no further introduction in our climate spaces, who is going to be one of the experts we will audition in the next couple of days with her former formal UNCTAD role, but is also a member of the commission, and clearly someone that has inspired a lot the connection between this national commission's work and the work that we're trying to do at the global level. So as you can see, we have an incredible panel of experts to share with us first their work, the challenges they're facing, the learnings they have collected over the years now of experience of the Scottish Just Transition Commission, and then start building the connections to this global mechanism that we are trying to build. So without further ado, Dave, Satwat, Elliot, Katie, the floor is all yours.
Thanks so much, Annabella. And I think the way we're going to work it is Satwat's going to give a bit of an overview. So it's a big time for us as a commission, because our final report is launched tomorrow right in the north of Scotland. So we're very busy with that, particularly Elliot. It's amazing he's still standing. But Satwat's going to give a bit of an overview about the last 4 years, which is our parliamentary term, is what we work to as a commission, and our key findings there. I'm going to talk a little bit then about some reflections about that, some of the transboundary aspects of it, how it fits in potentially to the mechanism, particularly around skills and workforce from my point of view. And then Elliot's going to talk a little bit about the international network work we're doing. And then Katie, if you're all right to round us up from the Commission's perspective with anything we've missed. So Satwat, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. That was an amazing introduction, Anna, to the Commission, and to myself and Dave, thank you. I just wanted to start off by saying, well, obviously, thank you for inviting us here to contribute today to these public hearings. The Commission in Scotland is an independent advisory body. We've been set up to scrutinise progress and provide evidence-based advice on how to deliver a transition to net zero that's fair, orderly and inclusive. I think one of the strengths of this commission has been the diversity of the membership, and the fact that we have social justice, environmental NGOs, academics, economists, business, community energy people, international just transition experts all coming together. And one of our principles is that we want to work to achieve consensus before we publish anything. So that's not been easy all the time, but it is something that we think has really, one, it lends weight to what we say. And secondly, it's easier to land in some of the constituencies who might find some of the messages more difficult. I also think being co-chaired by somebody who's a carbon climate expert and somebody with a social justice background has really shaped the work we've done and how we've done it. Do you know, how are those technical solutions going to land? What's the impact on people? What's the impact on place? And what do we do about the fact that all these are landing cumulative in communities that are already in many ways under siege from, a lack of investment in public services. A lot of the areas we've been working in and visiting, depopulation is a major issue. So there's a whole series of infrastructure issues which compound the inequalities where we need not to take an approach that's just and fair. But from our experience, I suppose our core message would be quite simple. A just transition is not only a moral imperative, it's a delivery imperative. And that's the space we need to think about how we get ourselves into delivery. And that transitions that people experience as unfair slow down. And that transitions that invest in people, communities, and fairness build public confidence and durability. And we're in this for the long haul. So we need to be having that as our foundations. So for us, when we've been going out and visiting communities and speaking to people, at heart, the just transition is about whether climate action reduces inequality over time. If it does, it will strengthen societies. If it doesn't, it will deepen divisions and slow progress. And having been one of the first commissions, all what I can say is that we probably have got lots of learning from what works and also what doesn't work and what hasn't worked that we've tried. So hopefully that can be of some support to those who are looking at it in other parts of the country. But in terms of Scotland's transition experience, that could be in industrial regions, oil and gas communities, islands, rural areas, land use systems, there are some themes that have emerged from all our work. And one of them is that transitions must be planned and managed. Unmanaged changes we've found have created jobs gaps where workers lose secure employment without credible routes into new opportunities. And once these gaps open, trust falls quickly and transition becomes harder to sustain. So an orderly transition needs to be, we need to anticipate what's coming. We need to coordinate the action. And these have been themes throughout the reports that we've written. And we need to have credible forward plans and not top-down plans, where we've seen some of the harshest and sharpest experiences of injustice and an unjust transition. It's vital that communities are around that table along with workers and those who may hold the purse strings. Transitions, the other thing we've noticed is are experienced locally, even when driven by global forces. So our work across regions has shown that the same national policy can have very different effects, and that will depend on local labour markets, local infrastructure, housing availability, institutional capacity, economic structure. Place-based planning, we would argue, is therefore not an optional extra, but it's central to fairness and effectiveness. Whilst the issues we might have heard about, for example, in terms of very severe levels of fuel poverty, may be the same in some of the island communities to what it may be in central Glasgow, the reasons for it and how we respond to it need to be shaped by the place and what's causing those issues. And thirdly, I'd say, before passing over to Dave, transitions interact with existing inequalities. And that's been a big message that we've seen. They don't begin on a level playing field. And if we don't design things in deliberately, we can reinforce regional inequality, insecure work, fuel poverty, rural disadvantage, and uneven access to opportunity. For example, industrial change affects not just employment, but supply chains, local services, community confidence. Transport change can reduce emissions, but risk excluding people who rely on affordable transport to access work, education, and care. Land use transitions can bring investment, but reshape livelihoods and community stability if not managed carefully. And these are the lived experiences we've heard about as we've spoken to over 900 plus people when we've been travelling around Scotland. And so it's not an abstract risk. So a just transition isn't just about replacing jobs, it's about protecting the social fabric that allows communities to adapt. And I'll hand over to Dave now.
Thanks so much, Satwat. And yeah, I must apologise for my sunshine here on the west coast of Scotland, which is gradually driving me around the room to find some shade. But as all of you who visited Scotland know, it's always like this here, particularly in winter. Yeah, and just to follow on from Satwat, I mean, I think all of us are in really reflective mode at the moment because we're coming to the end of our current term. And my background is as a climate scientist, and I'm a climate and carbon geek. And I came into the Commission very much with a emissions focus, emissions reduction, decarbonisation and resilience. And the scales have been kind of shed from my eyes by working as part of the Commission and understanding that all those things as a climate scientist we think should happen in terms of mitigation or adaptation, they are only as good as the work with the people who are going to implement them, live with them, be impacted by them. And so that for me speaks to the agenda that you're all leading actually. So the BAM, the mechanism as it develops, I think without them, then we're going to fail on Paris. We're going to fail even on 2 degrees or more. And I think that's true domestically for us in Scotland. We've got a government who has a good track record of ambition on climate. But if we lose the social license through not delivering a just transition, we lose the climate action, we lose the climate fight. So for me as a kind of climate geek, the just transition is the biggest, most important game in town. I think in terms of where the Commission is and some of the things that we would hope to see in the mechanism, and hopefully we can contribute to a certain extent, but also benefit from, is that knowledge exchange, that sharing of practice, good or bad, like we've been doing with some of the emerging commissions in other nations around the world. And that's so crucial. So one of the things we talked a lot to colleagues in South Africa about, and to other commissions in Ireland, for instance, they've now got one, is about how we monitor and evaluate a just transition. So actually, how do we show that we are achieving, hopefully, a transition which is not just about cutting emissions, but yes, like Satwat says, actually reducing inequality rather than making it worse or just business as usual. And that monitoring and evaluation work we've done, I think, is been really valuable in Scotland in terms of helping our government understand that they can do this. They've been brave in their new climate change plan of having indicators for just transition as a first step. Obviously, translating that to other nations, you've got very different contexts, different data sets, different starting points. But I think that monitoring and evaluation of progress or lack of progress is one of the key things I'd love to see as part of the new mechanism, actually, and sharing across nations in that way and at subnational levels too. And linked into that, I think, are these big transboundary risks. So obviously we saw at COP30 a lot of discussion about CBAM and trading and how actually when we've got domestic climate action or things veiled as domestic climate action, that they can have potentially really serious negative impacts in terms of transboundary to other countries. And I think most governments would recognise that they need to take that transboundary approach and actually do the monitoring and evaluation of how new legislation at home domestically will have an impact on not just global action on climate change, but actually on equality to avoid those negative impacts. So things like in Scotland, when we have legislation, we have an equalities impact assessment, which is a valuable thing where the government has to show how it's done its kind of assessment of what the implications will be for people in Scotland of their legislation. What I'd love to see, and I think, again, the Just Transition mechanism could help with this, is that same kind of assessment for things like CBAM, for that transboundary look at what does this mean for the world, not just us locally, subnationally or nationally. An example, say, for skills and workforce, which I obsess about a lot just in terms of enabling the transition. There's this real issue with our decarbonisation here in Scotland and the UK in terms of a workforce pinch point and having to bring in workers and skills from other nations, which is, that's great as long as it doesn't hollow out those other nations' abilities to decarbonise and to deliver for their people. And the example from Germany and India around PV is good on that in terms of thinking about yes, that joint way of working, that transboundary systems thinking, I guess, in terms of the transition. So what I'd love to see is this just transition mechanism obviously developing fast, because I think as Satwat made clear for us in Scotland, we're already, progress is not fast enough, and I imagine in all of your nations you feel the same way. None of us are doing this as fast as we should be in terms of decarbonisation in a fair way. And so, yeah, the mechanism, I think, can help speed that up by sharing good practice, but also avoiding some of the pitfalls that all of us have experienced, and sharing those can hopefully help us dodge them in the future. So I'll hand over to Elliot to tell you a bit more about the international context of our work.
Thanks, Dave. I'll try and be really quick. Thanks to Anna for the invitation to speak. I think these are really critical conversations and very timely, and we're really happy we've got something to say on the Scottish side of things. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about mainly is going to focus on some of the work we've been doing to build international linkages. Hopefully this is good news in terms of how this thinking develops around the mechanism and how the mechanism can best add value at national and subnational level. So last summer in July, really building off a set of relationships between different international advisory bodies around the world. Dave mentioned South Africa and Ireland, where there'd already been sort of peer-to-peer collaboration and exchange, really good practical conversations that were just, I think, helpful in both directions. Really, we thought it was worth having getting as many folk together who work on this agenda internationally as we could, including civil society groups, but mainly focused on advisory bodies like ours, to see if there was appetite for something more formal in this space. We found that there was tremendous enthusiasm and appetite for this. And so we're now in the process, having initiated that conversation, we're co-convening with colleagues at Australia's Net Zero Economy Authority, something called the International Just Transition Network. Our first proper meeting is next month. So this is all very timely, and on the agenda will be discussion of how to think about and how to perhaps help shape and even contribute and take part in the work around the just transition mechanism. So really interested to hear people's thoughts, and we'll be feeding that into the conversation that we have next month. In terms of what we're trying to do with the network, so the core mission is to strengthen practical delivery of a just transition through international collaboration. Some of the aims are to empower the implementation of just transition principles through collaboration, practical and technical exchange, aiming ultimately to build up and develop a repository of resources and tools to support new initiatives in getting off the ground. That's one thing that's been really clear, I think, as a kind of key learning for us, is that we expect that ultimately everyone's going to have to do this. And we in Scotland, we've been at it for a while. But we're seeing that even we have a pretty good story to tell in Scotland. It's obviously not perfect, but in institutional terms, there's a huge amount of learning that's really good to share for jurisdictions that are starting out or in an earlier phase of thinking about how to kind of square climate, social, and economic issues, and kind of bring those together through that, particularly through that kind of multi-stakeholder approach that we've been developing over recent years. And then more broadly, we're aiming to build linkages between relevant activities at global, regional, national, and subnational level, supported with technical expertise from relevant international organizations. So really trying to think about how can we play a positive role in making sure that those who are involved in the implementation challenge on just transition are really in a high quality dialogue with people operating at that international level and connected directly into the kind of international climate process. At the moment, we've got 9 prospective members for the network, and four countries that have expressed interest. That doesn't sound like everyone. It's not everyone, but it's a pretty good starting point. We've been learning from the International Climate Council's network. They've been up and running for a good few years now, and they've got about 20 to 25 countries involved. So we're starting from actually a relatively high base, but obviously the next phase will be all about outreach to make sure that we get a really, really good regional distribution, good mix of big and small countries, because I think it's in that mix of experiences and learnings that you really get the kind of richest conversation and the potential for really interesting collaboration and exchange. So yeah, looking forward to the discussion and hoping to learn more from everyone about how we in our work as the Commission and also through the network can play a constructive role in the discussions around the mechanism.
I'll do the quick rounding up. I don't want to speak for too much longer. I think everybody who's came before has done a fantastic job. Just want to mention 4 things. The first is that the international dimensions of just transition were highlighted in this iteration of the Commission. Back in our initial report, I've put it into the chat, where we saw international transition as a cross-cutting issue for Scotland's consideration of its own national transition. And there we highlighted 4 strategic priorities. First was do no harm. Second was using voice and diplomacy where possible to advocate for international just transitions. Third was providing material support where possible. And number 4 was knowledge and technology exchange, building sort of partnerships with countries in the South around being able to access the critical technologies, knowledge, capacity that they need for transition. Now, this was just a sort of a quick iteration of how we might begin to understand that, but I think it forms a good basis for the kind of thinking that countries can do about how their transitions can be internationally just. And then I suppose 3 things just to highlight from my experience as a commissioner. First of all is that one of the things that working in development economics is I'm always working around the constraints that developing countries face. And as a commissioner in the developed country commission, recognising that though there are constraints that exist there, and actually if more practitioners were able to dialogue with one another and find that common cause, that some of the things that hold back Scotland's national transition could actually be benefiting, the transitions elsewhere in the world. And there isn't enough dialogue on those sort of, whether they are economic or legal or, intra-jurisdictional multilateral barriers, where we are sort of like, well, what can we do at this point? Let's work on what we can do. But there is no space to sort of bridge those common causes. Another thing just to mention is that the advisory capacity that I think Elliot is and Satwat and Dave have been working on in terms of, bringing these different international experiences together. It's not been easy. It's not been easy to find the people. It's not been easy to bring the people together. And I suppose one question to throw back at folks thinking about the mechanism is, these are the people who are trying to do delivery. These are the people who are trying to make delivery happen in a just, socially inclusive, low carbon, adaptive, resilient way in their national jurisdictions. How can the mechanism empower that and really, empower those efforts so that you can build from that something that's greater than the sum of their parts? I'll stop there and hand over to yourself, Anna.
I mean, this is so good, and again, I mean, full of notes. Well, first, a massive appreciation also for bringing some of those learnings. I mean, that always probably, I mean, they look quite straightforward, but we know how difficult it is to put them into practice. I mean, in particular, in a climate decision landscape that has become quite hostile. And sometimes, and we were reflecting briefly on this right before the start, it's very difficult to be honest to the challenges we are facing on the social and inequalities and jobs dimension of climate action, and be true to what the challenges that communities are facing, and at the same time holding the space for climate ambition that we still need to hold, and offering an alternative way of doing it than what is actually blatant cynicism by some of the folks that don't want to see action and want to leverage some of these learnings sometimes to prevent us from moving forward. So just embracing the context in which we are, which is not easy, and is that line in which just transition is sitting, the space where we have openings, we have possibilities of doing differently, and at the same time, yeah, it's difficult, it's tough. We're talking about people's livelihoods, about their futures, about their hopes or lack of hope, about the state and decision makers working for them and their interests. So in that context, like a lot of what you were sharing in terms of the learnings, but also some of the practices that you've been building, I think it's very important for us. Of course, maybe the and I'm sure, I mean, Felicitas, you're also welcome to come in, but I'm sure the idea that all these institutions that are working on just transition nationally will cooperate with each other, I think it's absolutely welcome. I think there is so much space out there for synergies, for convergence, for learning with each other. It was also one of the reasons why we pushed so hard for a global mechanism on just transition, because for a long time we have been told that, well, just transition is domestic. Just transition is something that you do in your country. And it's true. Needs to be done in the country. And each country is it's specific, but no country is an island. Well, in the case of Scotland, part of one, but a very connected one. And someone in the hearing earlier say every local transition is also always global. And I found that very powerful, because I think sometimes we miss that global dimension of the practices we do in localities, but also how much they are impacted by decisions and processes and trends that are happening elsewhere. So I wonder, like, maybe your thoughts also on how you see that connection on the local to global, also in terms of the multilateral conversation or the multilateral space in which we are today. Extremely difficult, also very polarized when it comes to negotiations, including on climate. And maybe our perception that there is a lot of challenges that are in common for people that are trying to advance just transition in different spaces. So yes, your thoughts also on how the Commission, for example, could participate in such a mechanism, the role you think you could play, also being mindful as a subnational actor, I mean, yeah, bringing that all these different elements of your positionality into a multilateral space, which is not self-selected. I think we need self-selected practices. So all those that are convinced about just transition coming together, that's super cool. We are in a space where it's also about rallying others into this journey. So yeah, there is also where we need the voices of the convinced very present. So yeah, your observations, your thoughts on which kind of features we should have to attract actors like yours into that space. And yeah, and probably I had also a question about how you're seeing this connecting to some of these global rules that Katie was referring to. I mean, like, I'm sure you are facing this as well in Scotland. Like, the conversation on just transition is very connected to the alternatives that we can develop from an economic and macroeconomic perspective, like going beyond fossil in your case, but we cannot limit this to an energy conversation. We are really talking about deeper structural economic changes. For many countries in the global south, this is very conditioned by their position in the global division of labor, let's say. I mean, many of them build also their economies on extraction. Their debt is aligned, I mean, or connected to their ability to keep extracting. So layers of dependency that regions like Scotland face are also faced there with a couple of additional barriers related to where they sit in the global economy. So I know this adds complexity to the just transition conversation, and at the same time, we need to sit in that complexity. And I wonder your thoughts and observations of how a commission that has been dealing with these economic conversations could bring like also maybe a different, more empathetic spirit to what has been a very polarized space between North and South in many of these conversations. So yeah, just 2 questions. I don't know, Felicitas, if you want to chip in with any other observation. Do you want to read it out loud? Yes, go for it.
I was typing in the chat, but I wanted to ask, how can you institutionalize a network of experts as part of the mechanism structure, looking at how participation in the UNFCCC is structured right now and different just transition actors globally? And how maybe can the mechanism strengthen national just transition advisory boards, or how can it best complement the work that the Scotland Commission does at the moment? I want to start with that question, but I have I think I'll come back to it later.
Thank you so much, Felicitas. And this is, I think, one also that I'm quite keen to hear from Satwat, coming from a constituency, like, for example, I mean, single parent families with probably sitting with poverty challenges and inequality challenges. This is not a constituency that we have formalized in the UNFCCC. So your thoughts on how some of these groups that have been marginalized from decision making, how we can bring those voices also to the conversation. Yeah, that's super helpful. So over to you, folks.
I'll kick off then, seeing as there's a direct question there, and I'll leave some of the internationally bits that are processy to the academic. Sorry, but before I start, I just wanted to say a couple of things. I think whilst Scotland is a relatively small nation, we have to recognise that we have, we're part of the problems that have been created as a result of colonialism, as a result of imperialism. And we need to be looking at what's happening internationally, but also nationally through that decolonial lens as well. To me, that's something that's critical. We've benefited from being extremely extractive. We might be small, but we've probably got a bigger responsibility to address the issues and the problems that we've created. So I think size matters here, but it matters in terms of size of the contribution you've made to the situation we're in, as opposed to just being a country of between 5 to 6 million people. And I think that's why for us, in that first conversation we had, where Katie and others pushed hard for us to look at the international element, it was important to go beyond just do no harm. That should be the minimum position we take in what we do. And so what we are doing in order to ensure a just transition in Scotland, we have been completely clear about, as a nation and as a commission, cannot be as a result of offshoring our emissions, cannot be as a result of creating a low carbon economy based on exploitative, extractive measures happening elsewhere in the world. And that's why I think it's really important to bring together as many bodies as we can internationally to look at this issue, to look at these issues, because if we don't do it collectively, we're going to fail in terms of making it a just transition. If it's just in Scotland, but at the expense of elsewhere, it's not just. So, and that is a message we've been pushing long and hard. In terms of what do we do about those who find it the most difficult to get their voices heard because of the way we structure things and organize things, it was partly why we decided to take a people and place approach within the Commission. And through those, they were like deep dives into local areas and the issues in local areas. And it wasn't going just to hear from the usual voices. Yes, we did that. We met with local authorities, we met with energy providers, etc. But we also held open town hall type events where we had people coming in with what was important to them, what was mattering to them. And that was the starting point of those conversations. And it won't surprise any of us probably on this call that what we heard through more official channels wasn't the same as what we heard from the people experiencing the highest levels of poverty, inequality, in the most precarious, work that you can imagine. What they're wanting to do is see what tangible benefits there are going to be in their daily lives as a result of this transition. And that's the powerful message we've been taking back to government. So our final report isn't what we think as a bunch of commissioners, it's what we have heard from over 900 people across Scotland, some of the most marginalised communities where they have seen the worst unjust transitions taking place or in the process of taking place. And I think that's what's important, Hannah. And if you can get an international network going of those of us who are working nationally or sub-nationally, but very much face-to-face with communities, that's where we can build a body of evidence and support some of those communities to come alongside us into those discussions and be able to speak from their experience about what's going to make a difference.
Well said, Satwat. Yeah, and just to build on that, again, because we're coming to the end of our commission, we did a bit of work which was, I think one of our commissioners actually set us the challenge of, well, tell us some good news for a change. Like, where is there any just transition happening? And we've got a set of case studies on our website that hopefully you've all got access to or seen the link. But basically, that's a map for Scotland of places where this is bottom up largely. Just transition, facets of just transition are being realised. And so in terms of the mechanism and international networks, sharing those stories as well is really powerful, as well as, yeah, what Satwat says. We often, a lot of our face-to-face meetings with people they're at the cutting edge of an unjust transition. There are tears that, it's brutal what's going on for people here as well as around the world. And I think that speaks to the commonality. There are commonalities in terms of potential ways for success, but also how unjust transition is playing out for folk. And it's one of those things where I think if you and the mechanism can enable this, almost that community of practice or community of lived experience in terms of the transition would be hugely powerful. And I kind of think the way we've had conversations here in Scotland and we've talked about the transition, Satwat made the point that actually you could look at it through sectors and say, is this sector transitioning? What's our plan for it? The way people experiences it is that intersection of sectors and everything in terms of the context of their lives. And I think that's really important. One of the things I would say that we've been really conscious of is not being pushed into our work just being about the energy sector, for instance. And that does tend to dominate discussions. I know it does at international level as well. And this isn't just my bias as a farmer and a land use person. But I think our sector also is seeing a lot of unjust transition, and there's a lot of good stuff that can be done. It's true of all sectors, and obviously, like I say, people are impacted by multiple ones, and also jobs. So you could say, oh, just transition is about jobs in the energy sector, and that is part of it, and it's very high profile. But I think you lose a huge amount in terms of inclusivity, in terms of the kind of the reality on the ground, if it has that narrow focus. And certainly that's something we as a Commission have had to grapple with because of the North Sea has dominated a lot of our work over the last two commissions, because that's where the media is and where the politics is. But actually a lot of people are experiencing unjust transition who are completely removed from that geographically and economically.
Sorry, I just wanted to come in quickly to say one of the questions you'd asked was about how can we make the network work. I think it was what might help with the network. And I do think that when we all got together at the sort of initial meeting to see whether we were going to invest time into developing some sort of informal network, it was surprising, irrespective of the constituency of workers or some of the geographies across the world that were speaking about how many of the issues were common. So I think there's so much commonality there that we can use as our starting point. I think if we go into it with the spirit of collaboration, that would help, because it's very easy for us to be pitted against one another. And what we need to be showing is that actually there's enough here that unites us for us to take forward internationally. And an easy way into that is looking around learning and knowledge exchange, the softer entrance into this type of network and the support through the mechanism. I think been learning, knowledge exchange, but actually of what works on the ground. Because that was a big thing that came out of the conversations we had. It was, what have you done that's working? And I think that partly also led to the case studies that we've produced to show it is possible, to show what is working and where. And then we can go on to looking at some of the thorny issues, where there are going to be tensions between nations and between regions of the world. How do we address those? So there would be some of the ways that I'd suggest we can do it.
Elliot?
Yeah, thanks. Just in hot pursuit of Satwat and Dave, one of the issues that I think is likely to be generic in all kinds of different jurisdictions is a challenge in mainstreaming just transition. So you'll be dealing with the climate area of government and trying to progress a really sophisticated conversation and delivery model with parts of the government that deal with place, but obviously also crucially that deal with economy and social impact. And I think similar to what Dave was saying, I think the success of just transition as a as a mechanism, as a model internationally will depend on how quickly it can get to proof of concept through tangible examples. Now, obviously, those are going to be different based on where those examples sit, but there are certain generic elements in terms of processes, interventions around core issues where there would obviously be really good learnings for people to take. So I think in terms of Anna, your question around the convinced and the unconvinced, I think the way to get the unconvinced is by focusing on like one of the things that Just Transition does is it's a structure for thinking in a responsible democratic way, but in a structured policy way in relation to areas of really critical risk that are not necessarily political decisions. So in the Scottish context, there's really significant changes to the labour market, to our industrial profile that are not necessarily within the gift of government. There's a set of core issues around things like how people heat their homes, transport inequality, that a government of any persuasion and ideology would want to confront, right? Whether they did it for climate reasons or for political reasons or for economic reasons is sort of less important, I think. Than so I think the faster that the mechanism helps move from an abstract concept to a set of concrete tools, examples of where things have worked, albeit that some of these interventions and processes will be limited or imperfect, but that's kind of the vein that we're trying to think about how to kind of add value, because I think you will already see, kind of looking around the world, when you think about how, in particular in terms of industrial change, how the extent to which work in the communities are involved in advance in planning around their future, the extent of skills provision. That's a real challenge for government, but it does have to happen. And back to Satwat's point about one of the key things here just being about getting ahead of change and the value of time in terms of giving people time to plan around it, around these changes, rather than being in a reactive mode. And I think that also offers, for those that are convinced, it offers a way of maintaining that social license for climate action, because otherwise it's a rocky road. Katie?
Sure, I'm aware we're out of time, so I'll try and be quick. I think that I just want to highlight what Anna was saying about system challenges and the sort of economic framework, legal framework challenges, which I think has definitely been something that our commission has engaged with when we hear, something along the lines of, well, we can't afford to do it that way, so we need to find to do it this way, or, we're never going to be able to do that. And I think that, just as that one example of how austerity fiscal frameworks are holding back transitions and holding back the social justice element, that's a barrier that Scotland as a rich country is experiencing, and trying to deliver their transition. So, you can only imagine what that looks like from countries who are in a much more difficult fiscal position. And this speaks to some of these potential common cause areas where, people who are actually trying to do the implementation and being told these same sort of mantras can think together about, how do we revise some of those frameworks to build something that actually works to deliver a just transition rather than to hold it back. And then I think, there's a few questions on structure and process and elements of how you build the mechanism, and I wouldn't pretend to have a strong idea about that yet, because I think that there's so much thinking to be done on that. But I do have some ideas about what it shouldn't be from the perspective of being a national commissioner. I think one thing is like an expert network, I think, is something that would have never been able to deliver what the Scottish Just Transition Commission has done. And, Satwat has mentioned about how many hundreds of people have been engaged in the process of trying to scrutinise and advise Scotland's transition, as imperfect as it may be. So I think that, like, getting away from an idea of an expert network into something that, how do you build something that has that bottom-up element and that is nationally and regionally connected. I think something that it looked like just one country representative being sent to some mechanism, I think would just, end up creating that same situation of, how can one person represent, how can one, all of the different marginalized groups, experiences, pathways, just transition experiences. I think that that's also maybe not the direction to go in. I think, is maybe some of the audience are getting a sense of hearing people on the Just Transition Commission in Scotland's national experience and their interpretation of the international dimensions. It's a far cry from how we hear the conversations when it comes to between negotiators or when there's a politicized element there. And I think that that also speaks to the sort of voices that we want to hear, is like people who are trying to deliver this, with this spirit of cooperation that Dave and Satwat and Elliot have been mentioning. And then finally, what it shouldn't be is something that doesn't have the global discussion, right? Because, like, if we just go and say, this is what I did in my town, this is what I did in my place, those are valuable experiences, but then we don't get to the tricky bits. So those are just some thoughts from my experience as a commissioner, and someone much smarter than me has to think about what you actually build.
This is super helpful, folks. There's so much in there. And I will not pretend we can summarize, but there were several thoughts that I just want to capture also for our notes and on what you were saying. I mean, it's really about how we keep building on what you were calling like this people and place approach, how we manage to translate that into a multilateral space that has as its mission to figure out what is in common. And I think there is a tension that we need to navigate there. But we need to navigate it with imagination, with creativity, and yeah, which is what actually the Just Transition conversation brings in a lot of the spaces where it's being developed, like new ways of facing all challenges. And I think that's the spirit with which we need to embrace this. being intentional on how we hear from those that will not necessarily be heard. I love this idea of the community of lived experience. In the negotiations, there was a moment at COP30 where one of the ministers that helped in cracking this idea of the mechanism said, well, so what you want is a home for just transition. And it's true that we're trying to build that home where all the different communities, experiences, decision makers, thought creators can come together and exchange, also to support each other, not only for the sake of learning, but also figuring out how we can accelerate what others are trying to do, how we profile it better, how we learn more, how we also maybe redirect a bit of the international cooperation that today is going to approaches that ignore justice to some that strengthen the justice dimension as well. So I think there was a lot in there that we can use. The importance of not limiting the conversations to energy, but actually taking also on other challenges, other sectors. That is clearly in the scope, but at the same time, it's important to keep repeating, even from the listening exercises that you've been organizing, that this is also coming as a strong expectation from communities, that we don't limit ourselves to a specific sectoral transition. The importance also of showing, like, if not best practice, at least practice, like showing that people are trying and learning and showing where it's happening. This idea of getting ahead of change and timing is so crucial. And at the same time, always this tension with the urgency of change that is needed. And yeah, again, walking on these thin lines, that is also what Just Transition does. And I loved also, Katie, your ideas of how we ensure that the scope at least doesn't block us from what we need to become. So preventing some bad decisions is sometimes important. And the time would help us, and I'm sure this over your 8 years, I think, of work, the modalities of your work also evolved. What we just need to ensure is that we have the right framing for starting solid with this mechanism. And some of those parameters that you were sharing, Kathy, I think are really important, that this cannot be just expert only, cannot be just a single person show, that we really need to figure out the international dimension alongside the national one, and somehow bring to the multilateral space this bottom-up aspect that, from our perspective, is what can save the multilateral space in a time where we know what we are facing: genocide in Gaza, in Sudan, Cuba being cut from fossil energy just out of a government decision, and basically changes in government in other places in my region. Like, in these worlds of a trade war, like in this world in which we are keeping, like, pushing for all these anomalies in the multilateral system that still bet on cooperation, that's still trying to push the right ideas to the table. I think it's you shared a lot in here that I think will gives us more work so that we keep shaping the civil society position towards the BAM. But it was incredibly inspiring. And also appreciate, Satwat, your words on having a decolonial lens to this. We really need more voices in the so-called global north standing for those ideas. And yeah, that makes us feel very proud also, this cooperation with you folks. So yes, I think we've come to an end of this hearing. I think if you shared several links in the chat, we are also going to make them available as soon as your report is also out publicly on Thursday. it's more than welcome, so that we can also share it in our networks. And again, I mean, massive thanks for coming to these hearings, for inspiring us, and yeah, for sharing all your learnings. We feel extremely proud and grateful for the time you spent with us. So yeah, thank you.
And thank you very much for the opportunity to come and share those experiences. Thank you. And we
Thank
look
you,
forward
Anna.
to hearing how
Thank
it's
you.
all going. Thanks a lot.